To bring in, speaking of roving folks, let me bring in, I had booked a member of the House Democratic leadership, Congressman Jim Clyburn, the House Majority Whip. Obviously, it's been a sort of a busy day here on the Senate side. Oh, by the way, there's still a government shutdown. So I want to start with their congressman. Just simply this. What are you guys talking again? Are you guys going to get together with the president at any point here on day maybe 27, 28?
Well, I don't think, well, thank you so much for having me, Chuck. I don't think that we've stopped talking. The staffs have been meeting, and there have been a bipartisan group of senators who I understand have been sitting down with the president, trying to find some common ground on this issue. So we're meeting. Hopefully the leadership will get to a good place in the not too distant future.
What are you discussing? Are you discussing a compromise, or are you still sort of arguing over, well, let's open to the government first and then we'll negotiate? What is the official Democratic stance?
I think all those discussions are taking place. Sure, we want to open the government up right now. And if we can do that, I think it's the best thing to do, because we do have families and their security at stake. We do have a lot of futures brought into jeopardy because of this shutdown. So let's open the government up. But we can do that with legislation that also moves the funding issues forward. We've done that with 4 pieces of legislation last week, and we can do it, and we will put the bills up again this week. And if Senator McConnell were to allow a vote on any of those bills, the government would reopen right away, and we will have some policy for the state governmental agencies to work with.
Well, it would only open if the president agrees to sign those bills. Let me ask you this. Have you had a negotiation with fellow Republicans in the House and the Senate that say do you have many Republicans on the House side ready to give you a veto-proof vote in order to reopen the government?
Only if we get the Senate to act. I think that we got a definitive vote in the Senate. I think we could get to a veto-proof vote in the House. You cannot do it with the Senate still out. We cannot.
So if you can find 13 Republicans to put pressure on Mitch McConnell, that adds up to 60 here, or maybe they'd probably need veto-proof too. They need to get up to 67. So you think that that's doable in the Senate? You think it's doable in the House? I'm surprised that you think it's doable in the House.
I didn't say if they were to do that in the Senate, I think it would get done in the House. That's what I think. I don't know that, but I do believe if you got a piece of legislation that more than 2/3 of the Senate voted for, I think if the president were to veto that, I really believe we could get a veto-proof vote.
When is it time to try to go down that road? When do you give up with the White House?
Oh, yesterday.
You're done. Okay.
No, we aren't done. I'm saying you asked me when the time was. I think the Senate should do that now. We've had these legislations since last week. Any one of them or all of them could be wrapped into one piece of legislation, voted on, get 69 or 70 votes, send it back to the House. We would pass it. And if the president were to refuse to sign it, I really believe if the Senate were to sustain or to override a veto, the House would do the same.
I want to bring up the Steve King situation here, because it seems on one hand it looks like the House is united on some things on this, Democrat and Republican alike. But then there's these little dust-ups. I know that Congressman Bobby Rush thinks Democrats aren't being tough enough. And I'm sure plenty of Democrats think Republicans have gotten here too late. What is the message that you are trying to send to Steve King? Are you trying to force him to resign? Are you trying to encourage him to resign?
Oh, if it were up to me, I think that that's something I would have done a long, long time ago. The fact of the matter is, Mr. King has a long record going all the way back to his days in the state legislature of saying these kinds of things, meeting with these kinds of groups, not just in this country, but overseas as well. And we know that. I think this went on too long, and it's now time for the House to express itself collectively. Now, the reason I did a resolution of disapproval is because I wanted everybody here to express themselves on whether or not they approve or disapprove of what Mr. King was saying. We got a solid vote, all but one, saying we disapprove. Not only did we disapprove of what he said, we condemned white supremacy and white nationalism.
Steve King voted with you. What do you make of that?
Well, I sat in front of him while he was talking, and he looked at me and told me he thought that he could agree with everything I put in the resolves and that he would vote for it. And I was pleased to see that. However, being born and raised in a parsonage, I tend to focus on deeds rather than words. And so we'll see how he conducts himself going forward rather than what he said on the House today.
So you're not ready to censure, you're not ready to bring up an official censure?
Well, if a censure vote were to come to the floor, I would vote for it. I would not advocate putting that kind of vote on the floor just yet.
Why is that?
Okay. Well, the problem I've got is he was not on the House floor when he made these comments. He was not acting on behalf of the House of Representatives. He was talking to reporters at the New York Times. And so I want us to be very careful about whether or not we're stepping across the line in trying to censor, or I would say constrain, speech. So I don't want that to happen. So we'll see. But if he were to say the same thing on the floor,
that's a different
bringing
story.
disrepute on the House floor, I would be for censure.
All right. Congressman Jim Clyburn, Democrat from South Carolina, sir. Thanks for coming on, sharing your views as always.
Thank you so much.
Crazy busy day. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.